On behalf of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, I'm delighted to have you join us today. Before we begin, a few administrative details. We will follow our usual format for webinars. We'll begin with the presentation of our guest, Morris Switzer. At the end of the presentation, I will return to assist with the Q&A section of the program. You may, at any time, type your questions on the screen during the presentation. My colleague and I will group similar questions together in order to make the best use of our time. Thank you. To begin, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, including the Métis Nation. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land today and every day. Our topic today, reconciliation beyond Canada 150. For Indigenous peoples, reconciliation is about much more than having an opportunity to wear regalia and dance during Parliament Hill celebrations, or events such as Canada's 150th birthday. Reconciliation means more than words, be they apologies for past grievances or empty promises about better days ahead. Meaningful reconciliation will only start when Canada takes concrete actions to address the confiscation of Indigenous lands and attendant resources, actions that will help First Peoples become true partners in the prosperity enjoyed by the most recent immigrants to these territories. It is with great pleasure that I now introduce our guest presenter. Morris Switzer Benesi is a citizen of the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, where his grandfather, Moses Muskrat Marsden, was chief from 1905 to 1909. A member of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, he is an adjunct professor with the University of Sudbury's Indigenous Studies faculty. He lives in North Bay, where he is a member of the Sons of Jacob congregation, and operates Nimki Communications, a public education practice with a focus on the treaty relationship which made possible the peaceful settlement of Canada. In 2003, he received an Award of Honor from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for the Niigi Circle Public Education Initiative. In 2010, Morris was honored with an Anishinaabeg Nation Lifetime Achievement Award, and the following year authored We Are All Treaty People, a graphic novel that has sold over 14,000 copies. He was the first Indigenous student to attend Trent University and the first Indigenous publisher of a daily newspaper in Canada. Beyond all that, I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Morris for more than 15 years, back when he was with the Union of Ontario Indians and I was with Canadian Jewish Congress. Morris, it's great to have you with us, and I turn it over to you.
Oh, good morning, Len. Thanks so much. It's like having conversations with old friends, and I appreciate the opportunity that's being offered today by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. I had the privilege some years ago to serve on the first, they called it then, Aboriginal Advisory Committee of the CRRF, and they were sort of ahead of their time, starting to recognize that First Peoples are different from ethnic groups. We have a specific constitutional place in Canada, and so it's nice to always to chat with you, and I also want to acknowledge the technical assistance of Pran Mizir from the CRRF office in Toronto. It's very helpful, and for a virtual Luddite like me when it comes to computer technology. So it's a great privilege. I want to say that I'm pleased for the invitation. I'm pleased to be speaking to people from where I am in North Bay, which is on the traditional lands of the Ojibwe people of Nipissing First Nation. And the reason I'm so pleased to accept the Race Relations Foundation's invitation is that while National Indigenous Peoples Day, as we now call it, is a day to celebrate the role that Indigenous peoples continue to play in the country now called Canada. I feel in the very first Facebook post I sent out today encouraged all Indigenous peoples, certainly on my network, to tell at least one non-Indigenous person in Canada today something that they don't know about Indigenous peoples, because we have an obligation to tell people about who we are. Canadians have an obligation to learn more about who we are and our role in the creation of what's now called Canada. But we have an obligation to help them, to help share that knowledge. So I'm going to introduce myself. It's appropriate that I introduce myself in a language of my ancestors, which is called Anishinaabemowin. Some people refer to as the Ojibwe language, of which there are many dialects. And the way that I introduce myself and that many Indigenous peoples introduce ourselves is we say a name we've been given. And the name that I've been given is Benezi, as Len introduced me. And that's a shortened version of the name of a thunderbird, which when you hear, the next time you hear a rainstorm, a thunderstorm, I hope you think that rumble in the sky is by legend, by Anishinaabeg legend, that's the beating of the wings of a giant eagle-like bird. And for that reason, many of us, when we hear thunder, we're not afraid of it. It's a very warm feeling. We look forward to hearing it. And then I'm going to say my family name. And Indigenous peoples have clans, but many people in the world have clans. Scottish people have clans. Well, Indigenous peoples don't wear tartans, and I don't think there are many of us that wear kilts, but we identify our families usually by creatures we see around us in nature that perform some skill or some useful purpose. And my grandfather's name, before it was changed by missionaries, was Muskrat, and the name for that is Wajashk. And the muskrat in the Anishinaabe creation story is a very special being that helped. It was a very brave little animal that actually helped find this place we call Turtle Island, North America, and lost its life in the process. And I also have another clan. I have my maternal great grandmother's name was Esther Hill, and she is from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. So I have a clan in the Mohawk, in the Ganyagahaga families, and that clan is wolf or Maingan. That's the Anishinaabeg word for wolf. So you'll hear me say that, and you'll hear me say that my family roots are in the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, which is on the south shore of Rice Lake, about 30 miles south of Peterborough, about 20 miles northeast of Cobourg in southern Ontario. And my grandfather, as Len mentioned in my introduction, was the chief there from 1905 to 1909. And then you'll hear me say that I'm a citizen of the Anishinaabeg Nation. And terminology is a virtual minefield for people. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing, but the terminology changes. When I know when the well-known, highly renowned Indigenous Studies department at Trent University first started about 50 years ago, they were called the Department of Indian and Eskimo Studies. Well, we know that terminology has changed significantly. When we talk about nations, what was once the normal terminology to talk about every one of 634 communities like Alderville or Nipissing or Mississaugas of New Credit, they might be called First Nations, but they are really part of larger collectives or confederacies that are nations of people of similar background, history, culture, and language. and I'm part of the Anishinaabe Nation. There are about 40 of those communities, including the ones I've mentioned in the province of Ontario, and so we have a nation. Across Canada, there are probably about 40 nations, these confederacies of groups of communities that share these cultural values. So I'm going to greet you now in those words. Ani bojo benezi dijnakas wajash dodam Anishinaabe Mangan dodam Haudenosaunee Alderville Donjiba North Bay and Dayan Anishinaabe and Dow. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity. And before, there's so many things, Indigenous peoples don't know where to start to help create more awareness about our current role in Canada, our future role, and of course our historic role. We were the first peoples here. We are not an ethnic group. So we just are overwhelmed by where to start in providing knowledge to Canadians that will help them have more understanding about the country that they call Canada, which would not exist were it not for agreements by the first peoples who were here to share the use of our lands with them. And so today I've chosen to talk about the importance of the agreements that made that settlement possible, and they're called treaties. And I usually ask, it's difficult for me to do with this technology, but I'll ask everybody that's listening to please put up your hand if you think you're a treaty person. And if history holds true, most of you who are not of Indigenous ancestry will not put up your hand. And I'm here to tell you that you are a treaty person, that everybody in Canada is a signatory or a party to a treaty, because Indigenous peoples did not make these treaties with themselves. And one of the responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action is in the process of being implemented, where even the newest immigrants to this country are being asked not just to swear allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen, to the Crown in Canada, but to pledge to honor the laws of Canada, including the treaties. Every Canadian is a treaty person. Every Canadian enjoys treaty rights. Those of you who are listening, you enjoy property rights by virtue of the agreements that were made with Indigenous peoples. And you probably and almost certainly enjoy your treaty rights more than many of us who accepted you into our territories. For example, you may not know that the thousands of First Nation peoples who live on reserve do not own the land. They do not have property title to the land under the homes in which they live, because under the antiquated and racist Indian Act, which has been in force since 1876, the lands on reserves where First Nations people live are held in trust by the government of Canada. So you enjoy your treaty rights, and we're looking forward to the next 150 years in Canada where First Nations and Indigenous peoples get to enjoy our treaty rights. But before I get into those agreements that are so critical, that they're the foundation of this country, I want to talk about current events, and because they're relevant very much to that treaty relationship. And I'm listening this morning to CBC talk about our neighbors to the south of us and the challenge they're having with their president. I can barely bring myself to mention his name, who has overseen a process by which migrants as he calls them, primarily from Mexico, but they have similar attitudes to immigrants who come from different parts of the world. But in this particular case, they have caged the children of people fleeing their country, Mexico, trying to find a better future in the United States of America, which has always claimed that it's a bastion for people from around the world. The Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor welcomes boatloads of immigrants from around the world, and their language under the statue says something like, "Give us your free, give us your poor, give us your disadvantaged," etc. And it's, but unfortunately, we're seeing a nation that likes to think of itself as the greatest nation in the world, actually barring immigrants or caging them like animals and separating them from their parents. It bears in mind, everyone who is listening to me today, to understand that if you were not an Indigenous person, your ancestors were very probably refugees to this place that we now call Canada. I urge you to study the history of the parts of the world from which you came, from England, from Ireland, from Scotland, from France. The people who came here on what our social studies and history courses politely call voyages of discovery were in many cases people who were starving to death in countries like Ireland because of great crop failures, or from Scotland, where the lords who ruled over the lands, their tenant farmers, would refuse to reduce the rent, even though it was impossible for under many conditions of hardship for the Scots to pay those exorbitant fees any longer. And the immigration that began often began as people considered themselves religious refugees. They didn't have freedom of religion in Europe, and so many, in fact, most of the people who visited the shores of Turtle Island of North America were refugees, including Donald Trump's ancestors. And to see now nations that were welcomed by the Indigenous peoples here, by the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia, by the Anishinaabe people around the Peterborough area, where thousands of Irish settled after the potato famine, to see Mexican people refused admission into the United States in a respectful way. These are the direct descendants of Indigenous peoples who in many cases, welcomed Europeans into their homelands. To see that history reversed and turning on itself in this way is ugly. And so it appears that the United States has sort of mitigated its policy against separating the children from these migrants, but it's a temporary stay in their welcome to the United States. And a country like Canada, which prides itself on its achievements by welcoming people from around the world, and by turning their skills and knowledge and contributions into making what we like to think is a just society, a prosperous society. So please, let's all bear that in mind, that the first peoples on this continent called Turtle Island were very generous and hospitable to anyone who came in peace. They were welcomed. They were given food. They were shown how to create shelter for themselves, how to travel, how to navigate, where to go. They were completely lost. They showed them how to build canoes, how to make snowshoes. If you came from the south of France 500 years ago, you would have been totally devastated by coming to a place where there's 3 feet of snow in the wintertime. It would have been just like going to perdition. So across Canada, there are countless stories of First Peoples welcoming with open arms these poor, pathetic people who could not survive without their help. And we've seen gradually, as immigrant society developed and became societies called Canada and the United States, we've seen a gradual reversal of that same kind of attitude, of and almost an amnesia of how they had come here and their ancestors had come here barely a century or so earlier, to now excluding people from the nations from which they came. And it's a very sad turn of events. So I want to start by talking about that, and by people hopefully thinking about that and thinking about their ancestry and how and how people are not being treated by modern day governments the way Indigenous peoples treated the newest visitors to our shores. So let's talk about how Canada came into being. And we're very glad that in what Canada thinks is its 151st year, there were all sorts of celebrations across the country last year, because it was thought to be the 150th anniversary of what's known as Canada, the 150 years since Confederation, of what started as 4 provinces, and under a man called the father of Confederation, Sir John A. Macdonald from Scotland, whose ancestors probably were left, many of whom because of the cruelty and the poverty that they endured. And it's significant that most Canadians have no knowledge, and these are things that I wasn't taught in school. Much of what I'm talking to you about today I've had to learn in the last 25 years of my life, because I wasn't taught these things in school about treaties or about the roles and in activities of Indigenous peoples in before newcomers came here 400 and 500 years ago. So Canada's catching up now in its education systems, we're glad to say. So that's a good sign of what we call reconciliation, of improving the relationship between the First Peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and everybody else. We're glad that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that had 94 calls to action, asking for an improvement in everything from economic access for First Peoples to better educational opportunities, health opportunities, child welfare access. We're glad that these promises have been made. We're glad that a Prime Minister has stood up, Stephen Harper, in the House of Commons on June the 11th, 2008, and said that his government, and indeed all parliamentarians, apologized for the policies of assimilation that have tried to make Indigenous peoples literally disappear through processes like residential schools and other racist legislation like the Indian Act. And we're glad about those words. Apologies are nice. But, you know, we've had lots of words offered to us by newcomers since they started coming here. And the most important ones were in these treaties. And in Ontario alone, there are 46 treaties. And these treaties were to talk about the sharing of lands and of resources. And virtually none of the promises that were made in these treaties, and they're not ancient documents. My community, Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, are party to the Williams Treaties of 1923, and it's not unusual for treaties and associated land claims to take a century or more to be resolved. The Williams Treaty communities, this is one of the speediest treaty resolutions. They say that we're being offered a settlement now by Canada and Ontario, and it's only taken 97 years. That's remarkably fast. If you can picture, most of you who own homes, taking 97 years to have your real estate deal closed on your home, you can appreciate the frustration that means for Indigenous peoples. But even if they were ancient documents, which they're not, one of the things that the naysayers about Indigenous rights often use, they say these are ancient documents, and they have to be reminded a couple of things. One, they have to be reminded that we teach our children, hopefully, and our grandchildren, that the longer you keep a promise, the better a promise it was in the first place. That's real justice. And there are many ancient documents on which Europeans base their rules of law and governance. I'll just name one, the Magna Carta, which is about 800 years old, that is copies of which go on tour regularly around the world. And it had such principles in it as no arbitrary arrest of citizens. Nobody could be arbitrarily arrested and thrown in jail without any just cause. That's a pretty old principle, and it's ancient. We like to think that Indigenous peoples particularly like to think that a 300 or 400-year-old, or indeed a 95-year-old promise is pretty modern by comparison. And the Supreme Court of Canada has said that the honor of the Crown, that means Canada's reputation, is at stake in how it interprets its relationship with First Peoples, with Indigenous peoples, and in honoring the promises that were made. And regardless of whether they were made before Confederation in 1867 or today, there are modern treaties being signed. Today, the Algonquin are going to be signing a treaty that covers a good part of Eastern Ontario within the next few years. Regardless, that the honor of the Crown is at stake, and that is a fundamental principle of the rule of law in this country. Most Canadians might not be aware that their own Constitution, Section 35, subsection 1, says that the Constitution of Canada hereby recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. So we shouldn't be talking about a concept that most Canadians are unaware of. It should have been taught in schools. And unfortunately, much of this is just now starting to be taught in our schools, in jurisdictions like Ontario, where this curriculum is becoming mandatory and long overdue. So how did this relationship start? And some people say that the Vikings were the first people who came to what we now call Canada, and they likely were, and they didn't come in peace, though. Remember what I said about how Indigenous peoples usually welcome people that came in peace? Well, the Vikings were great conquerors. They had conquered, actually, the British Isles, but before that, they were, or around the same time, they were venturing further afield, and they landed on eastern shores of what's now Canada and places like Labrador, but they wanted to conquer. And they encountered fierce resistance from people they called Skraelings. They were probably Innu or Inuit people, to the extent that they decided that they would better go back home. And but the first real newcomers to Canada in any substantial number were the people from France who came here about 400 or 500 years ago. One of the most notable is a man called Jacques Cartier, who sailed up the St. Lawrence River and was greeted and welcomed and feasted by people from a village called Stadacona, and near the present site of Quebec City. And in response to this wonderful generosity that had been shown him, he proceeded to kidnap 2 of the chief's sons and take them back to Europe as sort of booty and proof to his financiers, the King of France, that he had indeed discovered something really novel. That's not how you make good first impressions with people who welcome you into their lands, but that was unfortunately how many of these relationships started. But the relationship between subsequent French visitors, people like Samuel Champlain, for example, and the First Peoples, tended to be very positive. Although as soon as the newcomers discovered the resources that were available, like in this case fur, they started turning what had been a sharing style of existence by Indigenous peoples, where everyone in a community benefited from hunting and trapping and fishing. All of a sudden, the Europeans introduced capitalism, acquiring wealth, turning natural resources into wealth. And that started to pit Indigenous peoples against one another in an attempt to dominate the fur trade. And again, when you see people who for the first time in their lives found they could have material objects, guns, ammunition, metal objects, that made their lives easier, all of a sudden the procurement of wealth became something that hadn't really existed before. And so we started to have wars. There were actually a century of wars, sometimes called the Beaver Wars, between the Anishinaabeg tribes, as they called us, and the Iroquois tribes over domination of the fur trade. And that became more acute when the British started making their presence felt in this part of the continent. And then the British and French started renewing the conflicts they had had across the ocean, and again the Indigenous peoples were embroiled. So the way of life changed drastically for Indigenous peoples. The more they welcomed people from Europe, the more they came embroiled in their political and economic quarrels. And of course, by 1760, the British had become the dominant force around the world. They were colonizing, and they had. I asked students, what were they looking for? Why weren't they happy to stay at home? Well, they didn't have very much land. You can fit all of Great Britain into southern Ontario, and they had lots of people, and they wanted those nice social studies stories we heard about them, all the Europeans looking for silk and spices, and that all sounded very nice. What they really were looking for was more land and places to put their growing populations, to start settlements. And when they found resources in these places all around the globe, that sweetened the pot for them. Interestingly, the British, after defeating the French at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1760, they were the dominant European force in North America. They had controlled the seas. They had a huge navy. They had defeated the Spanish Armada. They had defeated all of the European powers in battle. They were a mighty force, and they had been able to just walk into many third world countries, we would call them now, in places like Asia and Africa, and just by sheer military might, just conquer the local populations, the indigenous peoples there. But interestingly, they didn't do that in Canada. A lot of people think that that indigenous peoples here are conquered peoples, that we lost wars. Indigenous peoples have never been defeated in this place we call Canada. We have helped defeat invaders of Canada, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we've never lost a battle to Europeans here. First Nations have never lost a battle. We hope there aren't any. But the reason that that the British had very high regard for the indigenous peoples here and did not want to take them on in military ways was that they had seen how devastating indigenous peoples were in battle. And as if to make the point, after the British had defeated the French militarily and thought they were going to start colonizing in a big way in what's now Canada, a leader who's known as Pontiac, I was taught in my social studies, and who really, his name is Obandiag, he was an Odawa chief. He lectured some of the British generals. He said, just because you've defeated the French, don't think you're our masters. And to demonstrate that, and one of the reasons for his upset was that the British, one of the changes that came in their settler dominance from that of the French was that they were very cheap in trading, and they objected to the protocol of paying rent or tribute to the First Peoples for using their territory, for crossing their territory. And Obandiag told their generals in no uncertain terms that they weren't going to bow down to the British just because they defeated the French. And with barely 200 warriors, he proceeded to do something that the French could not do in all their years here. He captured 9 of 11 British forts on what was called the western frontier of Canada, which would have been southwest Ontario. That astounded the British, and with all of their red coats and their military presence. And so they huddled back in Europe, and they decided, on the advice of King George III's political and military and economic advisors, they decided they better try diplomacy. And their chief diplomat was going to be a young man, a brilliant young civil servant who originated in Ireland, and his name was Sir William Johnson. And he lived in what's Upper New York State now with a woman whose name was Molly. Some people say it was Mary Brant, whose son, or perhaps brother, was a man named Joseph Brant, after whom the city of Brantford is named. And Sir William Johnson was given the task, he was given the title of Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for British North America, which at this time was seen to include the 13 colonies to the south of us, where, again, refugees had come, people called Puritans or Pilgrims, to what's now the United States, as well as into the heartland of what was going to become Upper Canada or Canada. He was given the task of making a case for these First Nations tribes. The document that was produced in October the 7th, 1763 was called the Royal Proclamation, and it referred to the Indian tribes of North America. And so Sir William Johnson played a part in the crafting of that document, which set out 2 very important principles that are still being recognized in common law by the Supreme Court of Canada. It says that the Indian tribes of North America are nations. Nations. You only make treaties with nations. And it said that they have title to their lands, and that nobody, no settlers, should molest them in their lands. They were guaranteed the protection of the Crown if they agreed to treat and that any dealings with Indians about their lands would have to have the Crown as a facilitator. They would have to be an intermediary. Now, the Royal Proclamation, while it contains some very important principles, is problematic because there was sort of an underlying assumption that the British had some sort of stake, some sort of sovereignty in this territory, but nonetheless, it recognized the sovereignty of Indigenous, of First Peoples, of First Nations peoples, of Indians. And the problem with that was, as good as it might have sounded on paper, they didn't have email or telegraph or modern technology. So how to get that message to the Indian tribes in North America? So Sir William Johnson was involved in convincing his superiors that what was needed was a big gathering of the leaders. And the heart of this new continent, which would have then been known Canada, was the territories around the Great Lakes, north and south of them. And remember, those colonies, English colonies, were still away on the east coast. And so Sir William Johnson decided that he called on the leaders of 24 nations of people who were seen to be a confederacy around the Great Lakes. They were peoples like the five, at that time, 5 Iroquois or Haudenosaunee nations, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Oneida, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Anishinaabeg nations, like the Nipissings, the Ojibways. There were people south of the Great Lakes, like the Shawnees, the Menominee, the Fox, the Sioux. And those are the nations that were recognized as the people who controlled the territories, all of which now Canada and the United States. All of the land was controlled and used by Indigenous peoples, by Indians. And so runners were sent around to the territories around the Great Lakes, and they brought a message from Sir William Johnson on behalf of the king that he wanted them to assemble near Niagara, near Niagara Falls at Fort Niagara, which was a great British outpost, the following summer in July of 1764. And we're told by historians that the gathering that materialized there, because all of these leaders decided they would come, we're told they conducted ceremonies and believed that the settlers were going to start coming to their lands from across the Salt Sea to the east. So they were going to listen to what they had to say and try to come to some sort of an arrangement, a mutually convenient arrangement with them. So historians say that the largest gathering of Indigenous leaders that perhaps ever took place on this continent took place in the summer of 1764 at Fort Niagara. They estimate there were 3,000 Indian leaders, chiefs and headmen at that gathering. And Sir William Johnson, again, because there was no giant screen TV and no microphones, he met with them over a number of weeks, and they would have met in circles for him to relay firsthand the words of the Crown, the offer that they wanted to make in return for the permission to share the lands that these nations controlled. And he gave wampum belts, and you're going to see in this first image the central image of the Treaty of Niagara Covenant Chain wampum belt. And it was a long belt that was made out of the shell of a creature called the quahog, and whelk shells, which were white. The quahog had some purple. It was a sacred creature, had been revered for centuries by the people of the East Coast where these shells were found. And it came from the bottom of the sea, and scientists now understand that the quahog was likely the oldest living creature ever found. They have found quahogs that are over 500 years old and still living. And So the belts they look blue here and white. They were more of a purple. Sometimes they were close to black, depending on the shell. And this was language, this was documentation that the Indigenous peoples could understand through translation because it showed a story. And some people regard the Treaty of Niagara Covenant Chain Wampum Belt as a constitutional document. 103 years before the Confederation of Canada, this was the document that said Indigenous peoples were prepared to share the land that we now call Canada. There wouldn't have been a confederation 103 years later if it hadn't been for this great gathering and an agreement. So these two figures, one would represent the crown or the king. One would represent the nations, the tribes, the Indian tribes of North America. They're holding hands, which even elementary school students know, recognizes, and symbolizes peace and friendship and alliance, and it represents sharing. That's what you do with your allies and friends. And you can see that there's a heart, because the Indigenous peoples believed that this was a sacred covenant. The word covenant was one that had been used when dealing with First Peoples from the earliest Europeans, the Dutch probably, when they settled in the eastern seaboard, and they talked about a covenant chain of friendship with the First Peoples. So this was at the heart of this document, this relationship of friendship and sharing and peace and alliance. And the next, you can get a better look at the belt from the next image. It shows me sharing information at the Curve Lake First Nation powwow just outside of Peterborough, Ontario last year. And incidentally, Curve Lake is one of 7 member nations that are party to the Williams Treaties of 1923, along with Alderville. And you can see closest to me, my hands are leaning on that Treaty of Niagara covenant chain. You can see the links. There are actually 5 links of the chain. You can see the 64 on the right-hand side. The 17 is to the left of my right hand, and that's the date of that agreement. And when Sir William Johnson gave these 2 wampum belts that are on the outside of this table, the one closest to me, the covenant chain belt, and the one closest to the visitors to our table, that's called the 24 Nations belt, representing all those nations. So Sir William Johnson's diary records that he said, "My brothers, I give you this belt that will forever link you, bind you to the English." And of course, what he was saying is, we want to be friends with you in peace. We want to be allies with you in war. This was the relationship. This was the relationship that started Canada. This was the fundamental, the cornerstone of what was going to become Canada. When he gave, and again, he repeated these messages to all of these council fires that he held with the different groups, the thousands of leaders over that month. And it was a ceremonial event. They shared the pipe. They smoked tobacco, a sacred ceremony that when you made these promises and smoked that pipe, it was like putting your hand on a Bible in a court saying, "I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." And when he gave that other belt, these documents made of these sacred beads, at one end of the belt, and you can't see it well, but at one end of the belt is what looks like a lodge. Some people say it's a rock, and that represented Canada, this continent, this land. A little grade 3 student said, "You know, if you look at it in a certain way, Mr. Switzer, it almost looks like a turtle." And she might be right, because we call this Turtle Island, and she might be right. All the experts missed that, but this little grade 3 girl saw that. And the other end is a ship. And again, the British fleet was what had helped them conquer other nations and colonize places around the world. And Sir William Johnson said your people will never be poor as long as the world exists. All you have to do is pull the rope that binds your nations together, and at the other end it's attached to that ship, and we will bring you whatever you want, any material things. That was clearly understood by those leaders. And he also promised, a promise that was repeated to get assure the alliance of the Indigenous peoples in the War of 1812, 38 years later. He also promised, and if you Google Royal Proclamation line, you'll see a map that reinforced the promise of the Crown that if the Indian tribes of North America, those 24 nations, agreed to share the lands around the Great Lakes with a known Canada, there would be a huge swath of the center of the continent set aside exclusively for them as Indian territory. And that's west of the Appalachian Mountains, all the way out to what was then Spanish territory on the west coast of California. So this was a huge promise. And if you look at maps dated from that period, you will see Indian territory, all in that area to the west. So, and further, to add to the sales pitch, Sir William Johnson, his diary records that there were 20 ships, 20 British ships that were anchored in the nearby Niagara River, and his diary records that they were laden with gifts, presents. And the word presents, when it's referred to that way by English people, it's really rent. When you drive on toll highway 407 and you get a bill, you don't give a gift or a present when you get the bill. That's a toll. You are paying rent. And so these, to seal this deal, this was an advance rent payment. And those 35,000 gifts included guns and ammunition and metal objects and pots and pans and blankets and tobacco and countless objects. 35,000 gifts, presents. That's why this belt is sometimes referred to as the presents belt. But again, it's not gifts, it's rent. You had to, the practice that the British had trouble adjusting to, remember, was paying tribute to cross native land. So this was a big tribute. And so if you look in the middle of that table, there's a historic wampum belt that was first exchanged between the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois peoples, and the Dutch in 1613. And that image, that two-row wampum image, had endured across Indian country. And the tribes around the Great Lakes understood the meaning. It meant that in the river of life, on those white beads, there might be two journeys, and one of those journeys, one of those purple journeys, that row of those beads would be by the Indians in their canoe, and the other would be by the settlers in their boat, and they might run parallel, and they would respect each other's path, but they wouldn't interfere with one another's journey. They wouldn't try to steer one another's boats. So we're told that the leaders, before they accepted these promises at Niagara in the summer of 1764, that they brought out that two-row wampum and they showed it to Sir William Johnson, and they said, "Now, do we understand that you respect this principle and it still applies even when we start sharing?" And he assured them yes. And again, he was a man who lived among the Iroquois people, the Haudenosaunee people, and he understood this belt, this treaty. So the Indigenous leaders accepted. That was when Canada began, in July of 1764. On the lands around Niagara. And if you look at the next image, you get a bit better look. And this is again a visitor to the Union of Ontario Indians office, and it's a history professor at Nipissing University, Nathan Kazaskanich, And he was there to learn more about, he's a history professor, but wanting to learn more about the history that he wasn't taught in school about how Canada came into being. And he wanted to know about these Wampum Belts. And so I was trying to share what knowledge I had learned about them. And this is what respectful educators and other Canadians are doing, we hope, as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions. And they're seeking out more knowledge about the things that they weren't taught in school, about Canada's real history. The next image is a treaty medal, and it was the custom that the British, the treaty commissioner, pictured at the left, you can see again that symbol of holding hands, of friendship, and you can see that symbol of an Indigenous leader shaking hands and agreeing, you know, to a treaty. And you can see that really important image in the left is the sun rising, and the promises that were made were almost invariably made with words like this: these, you know, we offer you these promises that will be in place as long as the sun rises in the east, as long as the grass grows, as long as the rivers run. And sometimes they said as long as the British wear red coats, and they still do. These medals were often given to the leaders, and they would wear them around their necks, not as subjects of the crown, but as allies of the crown, and to show that they had brought back to their people agreements that would ensure them some level of prosperity, the prosperity that had been promised. Now, the next slide actually is taken from one of those 46 agreements in Ontario, and it's called the Rice Lake Surrender of 1856. I'll just preface this a bit. The first test of that Big Niagara Treaty was in 1812, 38 years later, when the United States, the fledgling United States, which had broken away from the mother country, from Britain, they didn't want to be a colony, they decided they were going to invade Canada, and where many of their relatives lived, they thought it would be an easy matter to take over Canada and make that part of their growing little country. And the leader of the settler colony, burgeoning or starting colony in Upper Canada, was a man known as Sir Isaac Brock, and he was the political and military leader. He was a general as well as a lieutenant governor. He recognized the signs of war. He also recognized that what few militia and regular troops existed in his settlement could not begin to repel American invasions. They had about 40,000 troops under arms. There were only about 1,000 British regulars west of Montreal, operating basically as a police force. All of Britain, the British Army, were back now. The French and English were fighting again in Europe, this time Napoleon. So Sir Isaac Brock recognized the importance of this alliance with those Indians, as they call us. And he worked primarily initially with a man called Tecumseh, who was from that Shawnee territory south of the Great Lakes. The Shawnee, remember, had been signatories in 1764. Not signatories, they'd agreed to the Treaty of Niagara and to be allies. And those nations had seen the way that the fledgling American state had trampled on the rights of Indians. They didn't feel that the Indigenous peoples had any rights to land or anything, and they just were starting to squat on their lands and to try to scourge them out of their traditional lands. So the Indigenous peoples decided they would side with the British. After all, they were defending their lands, their traditional lands. And So most Canadians do not know that Canada's Defence Force in this, the only war ever fought on Canadian soil was the War of 1812. And Canada's Defence Force primarily consisted of 10,000 Indigenous warriors. And they were led by men, and I asked teachers, have you ever heard of these names? Pequinawatic, Asiganak, Meskwaki, Ashawanu, Shawandas. You've never seen those names in social studies or histories textbooks, and they were 5 of Canada's greatest military heroes. And they were responsible for fending off the American forces who vastly outnumbered them, and kept Canada pretty well, you know, in the boundaries that it has today in that part of the country. And the significant thing is that this began to show the lack of respect for the treaties that the Crown had, the British had, because the people who had played the biggest role in the War of 1812 and who had suffered the most casualties, civilian and armed, were the Indigenous peoples, and they weren't invited to the Peace Congress in Europe at Ghent in Belgium on Christmas Eve, 1814. They weren't even invited. And that marks the beginning of some of the bleakest part of Canadian history, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for the country. Once that threat of war had disappeared, the British started immigration in a huge way. So whereas at the time of the Treaty of Niagara, when the Indigenous peoples vastly outnumbered the settlers, there were only about 10,000 Europeans in probably all of Ontario, what's now Ontario then. By 1850, the number of Europeans, primarily British, in what's now Ontario were about 1 million. It's phenomenal growth. And unfortunately, with that growth and with came land grabbing, and even the military force of soldiers acting as police officers, you know, were unable, and frankly, the political powers were unwilling to stop that erosion of Indigenous lands that had been promised by the Treaty of Niagara and the Royal Proclamation. And it was that fast that literally within a couple of generations after the War of 1812, Indigenous peoples were literally cornered in lands that they had totally dominated less than a century before. And waves of immigration and law breaking. The immigration was characterized by land theft. There was no other word for it, and all of the treaty promises were broken. The annual meetings and paying of rent and tribute, they went by the boards. So that by the mid-1800s, the treaty process had been seen by the colonizers, the Crown, that were now creating larger settlements and land bases. The treaty process became a very cynical way to get land away from Indigenous peoples whose very lives and livelihood were threatened. So they started to create the concept of reserves, that they would really shuffle the Indigenous peoples onto reserves, much like Donald Trump is shuffling migrant children into cages. And the treaties, as you can see from this slide, you can see the names on the left of the Indigenous leaders, and in this case from Alderville, from my community. And those were their English names, with the exception of Joseph Skunk, who is, I believe, an ancestor of mine. But you can see that the handwriting is all the same. So what that means is that the people who, quote, signed the treaties couldn't read them. So they trusted what they were being told. And when they were being told that they would always have the rights to hunt and fish, and the king and the king's governments would always look after them and protect them, They believed them. They couldn't believe anybody would break a promise. Again, these treaties were probably made in ceremony, all sorts of ceremony. And what they did to indicate their agreement was they put their clan symbol. And you can see hoof clans, or moose, or deer, or reindeer. That little creature at the bottom, I'm not sure whether that's a muskrat, but that's my grandfather's clan, Wajashk. And unfortunately, subsequent history has shown us that from about the middle of the 19th century right up until Confederation, which was not very long after that, all of these lands were removed from the care and control of the people who had dominated them since time immemorial. So what reconciliation, and fast forward through deliberate starvation, we're told, of Western Plains Indians, by deliberate killing of buffalo, treaties to convince the indigenous peoples that their only path out of starvation was to accept the promises in treaties and go into reserves, and where they were, the governments tried to turn them into farmers like they thought all good English people would be, through residential schools, through the Indian Act, which basically treated indigenous peoples as if they weren't persons, didn't have a role in Canada, through residential schools, in which 150,000 indigenous children were forced away from their parents, and at least 5,000 to 6,000 of them never came home, and which, by the way, that mortality rate is higher than that of Canadian soldiers in World War II. 1 in 25 indigenous children that went to residential school never came home alive. And through all of those, the bleakest years for indigenous peoples, the subsequent social and economic marginalization and dysfunction, we now are in an era where the government is now telling us that we're in a period of reconciliation. We've apologized. We're going to make things better. We're going to restore the type of jurisdiction that our first peoples enjoyed when they first welcomed us to our lands. But these promises are starting to ring hollow. There are bright signs, and you'll see on the next slide, you'll see me and two wonderful school teachers in Guelph. And we're seeing reconciliation on an individual basis, which is where it has to start. It has to start with each individual, and then hopefully into their families, around dinner tables, hopefully into their communities and their political leaderships, and then into their nation, where we all, practice what we preach, and not just words, but say, there are land rights that are unresolved, hundreds of them across the country, where we're not giving back lands that are occupied, but about 90% of Canadian land is what's called Crown land. It's available to as some sort of way to help rebuild indigenous communities and help them create economies. Some communities are further ahead because their land base is more desirable. But these two teachers on the left, on your left, Julie Richer, and on your right, Christine Pertz. One of them teaches in a public school in Guelph. One of them teaches in a separate school, a Catholic school, and they are living examples of reconciliation with their students at those two schools. They created a two-row wampum belt under the guidance of a traditional teacher, and that belt goes back and forth between the schools. And despite religious differences and educational differences, they meet regularly, they compete in sports, and to me that's a living model of what reconciliation can be. And starting in that small scale, hopefully that will go up to a point where all Canadians are trying to make the country one, and that for Canada's next 150 years will be really more inclusive, and one in which First Nations are able to build economies, send their children to the same quality schools, have the same access to quality health care as other Canadians enjoy because of their treaty rights, have their children who find themselves in need of child welfare, have their agencies funded at the same level as others. And so I'm hopeful that it's through these tangible ways that reconciliation is really going to be more meaningful than mere words for Canada's next 150 years. I appreciate very much your listening to me and being patient, and I'm hoping you have questions that I'm hopeful to answer. Miigwech, Yawa.
Miigwech, thank you so much, Morris, for sharing your view of the history of relations between Indigenous people in this country. It's a long history, and it's had some bright moments, but clearly, if history teaches us anything about the future, it's that there is still much work to be done. So again, we do encourage participants or members of the audience to type their questions in, and Con and I will bunch them together and try and answer as many as we can. Morris, while we are waiting for some folks to offer up their questions, I'd like to go back to really the very beginning of our session, where we offered the traditional greetings, right, and you added to those based on where you are. So certainly it's now become quite common for events to begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional caretakers of the land. Personally, I've often wondered how such acknowledgements are received. Are they viewed as being positive, better than nothing, or perhaps even a little hollow, given ongoing problems in the relationship between Indigenous people and the Government of Canada? And here specifically, I'm thinking about some of the work that you've done around the Zibi development in the Ottawa River Valley.
Well, thanks, Lynn. And just to give a bit of context for those of you who might not be aware, in Ottawa there's about, I think, about 15 to 30 acres of land on Chaudière and I'm not sure the other, is it Albert Island? I think the other island. There are two.
I think so.
Yeah, two islands there in the middle of the Ottawa River, and they're very sacred places. If you have not seen the Chaudière Falls, you should know that for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples, primarily Algonquin peoples in that area, at Champlain records in his diary seeing them, hold ceremonies at this site, and it's like it was seen by Indigenous peoples to be like a giant pipe, like a sacred pipe, and the steam from the falls, Chaudière Falls, rises in the air almost as if it was smoke from a sacred pipe, and was seen as a very sacred landmark. And the late Algonquin elder, Grandfather William Commanda, had a vision that whole area could be transformed into sort of a national cultural heritage Indigenous site, where people close to Canada's capital, all those people who come to Canada's capital, could come and learn about Indigenous presence in Canada's past and future. And his master plan was approved by a former member of the National Capital Commission, who's since passed away, and he received. He was given a key to the city of Ottawa. Everybody was so impressed with this idea. And then, as has happened to all these other promises that we talk about, treaty promises, and that just sort of disappeared to the point where now there's a developer, they call themselves Windmill Developments, I think they call themselves, in Ottawa, who have convinced city fathers that the best use of that land is going to be a 1,200 condo unit development with office towers, and it's going to pave over a sacred site. And it might bring a lot of revenue into the city, but as I said in a news release, because there's going to be a walk to Parliament Hill from near there on Victoria Island on Friday, tomorrow, I encourage anybody in Ottawa to participate in it, to show your displeasure at paving over a sacred site. It's tantamount to name your biggest cathedral in Ottawa. It would be like just taking a wrecker's ball to it, and because maybe some developer wanted the land or had a way to get more revenue for city coffers, more tax dollars. So let's just knock down this cathedral and pave it over, and we'll put up some condos. So if they do, I don't know if at Ottawa City Council meetings they start their meetings with a territorial acknowledgement, or as they do in many communities. But if they do, at the same time as they have just awarded $60 million to the developer to clean up the site that was caused by previous industrial occupants, that's the biggest hypocrisy that one can imagine. And it's indicative of how a relationship that was once seen as really honorable and respectful between First Peoples and newcomers, how it's deteriorated, where you don't even respect someone's spiritual roots or heritage. So these territorial acknowledgements, they become almost just lip service, and they are a kind of a form of political correctness, unfortunately. And we'd like, if people want to acknowledge that they are on someone else's traditional land, we'd like them, to show that they mean that in a tangible way, and that means please don't pave over our sacred sites if you respect our occupancy here.
No, thank you, Maurice. I'm put in mind of, I think it was Elder Dumont who was speaking about this a few years ago, said that if this is essentially, if this is the white man's idea of reconciliation, then their definition and mine are really quite different.
Exactly.
Okay. We have a question from one of our attendees. It goes, very informative, thank you. Do you have any thoughts on the abolishment of and what could replace the Indian Act?
Well, the Indian Act just has no place. The Indian Act from 1876 to today is the only piece of racist, it's a race-based document. It's the only piece that exists in the world, I'm told. They don't have anything. There might be racism. I'm sure there's racism everywhere in the world, in every country, but there's no piece of legislation, I'm told, even in formerly apartheid South Africa, that so diminishes the humanity of one segment of a nation's population like the Indian Act does. Literally, it presumes that literally from cradle to grave, every Indigenous, every First Nations person is controlled by some functionary in the federal government, and it's been so ludicrous that technically a First Nation band council is not allowed to spray for weeds without the permission, without passing a resolution that's approved by the Minister of Indian Affairs. It's well, to say it's antiquated is a gross understatement. There will be no Indian Act in the future. This great transition period where we're developing new, up-and-coming, intelligent, educated, culturally competent First Nation leaders who are going to have to manage that great transition from dependency on forced dependency, I should say, on Canada's federal government, to self-sustainability, to developing our own economies, to developing our own systems of governments. The systems of governments, the first past the post system of governments, for example, that just doesn't work. Like here in Ontario, we just gave a party a majority government when fewer than half the people in the province voted for. Fewer than 40% of the people in the province voted for them. That's not democracy, and that's a system that was imposed by the Indian Act on First Nations, because the British people thought that's the best system in the world. It doesn't work for Europeans. Why would it work for Indians? So there's a huge amount of work that has to be done, and you know, to eliminate the Indian Act, we have to replace it with good leadership, with sound economies, because self-government means more than just good governance systems. It means knowing how to feed your people, and all that goes back. All of it goes back to the land, and it goes back to the settlement, the fair and honorable settlement of these treaties, because nobody can build an economy without a land base. Nobody ever has been able to. So that's a kind of a long way around of saying, yes, the Indian Act is on its way out. It's been here for, you know, since 1876. It's not going to go out overnight, but it's going to take our best and brightest up and coming new leaders to you know, to create systems that are going to make it impossible for it not to disappear.
Maurice. Again, we do have time for a few more questions. So folks in the audience, please do put your hands on the keyboard and make your fingers dance. While we are waiting for the fingers to dance, Maurice, if we can go back to one of the comments you made about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action. One of the things that struck me about those calls to action is that largely they comprise actions which are to be performed by various levels of government. But of course, you know, we have 35 million people in Canada, so it goes back to I think a very important question, which is, forgetting about the role of government, what can individual Canadians do to demonstrate their commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation process and a fair and favorable outcome for Indigenous Canadians and for non-Indigenous Canadians?
Thanks, Len. Yeah, it starts with the individual. It's very important, and I think if there was one thing I'd like to do over about the Truth and Reconciliation, a lot of people forget that over 20 years ago there was a larger report called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that had 440 recommendations, not just 94, that was the result of culminated a 5-year soul-searching process across Canada, but which I believe the federal government did a horrible job in communicating to Canadians. I talked to many people who never heard of RCAP before, so it's not as if this is the first time these issues have been raised. So the unfortunate thing about these great commissions, these great navel-gazing exercises, is that they are not delivered in a way that make people feel they have a personal stake in it. It's delivered in a way that people think, oh, that's something that Ottawa is looking after. Oh, that's something Toronto's looking after. Oh, that's something Regina's looking after. Reconciliation starts with the individual. It hopefully means you feel interested enough in wanting to live in a good country that you will go out and start talking to Indigenous peoples and talking to them as friends, as neighbors. Find out about them. Today, all across Canada, there are powwows. Here in North Bay, there's a cultural gathering on Nipissing First Nation. The North Bay Indigenous Friendship Center is having a day open to the public. Those people are not taking the day off to which they're entitled. They're seeing how important it is to you know, inform people about things they didn't know about, treaties, about, you know, their rights. And I really, I'm hoping that, and there are a lot of Canadians who really feel the personal importance of doing this. And I had a woman at an event I spoke at last weekend, and she said, well, you know, she said, and this was a good church, God-fearing woman, it was at a church. She said, you know, if we had known these things were going on, like residential schools, we would have done something about it. And I took issue with her. I said, I don't know whether you would have or not, because nobody did. And it happened for, you know, until 1996, over 100 years. And I said, we have to hopefully have friends in Canada who really think they have to get involved. And I said to her, I said, well, I don't understand why people are so afraid of politicians. We only have about 300 members of parliament in Canada. We have 35 million Canadians, as you said, Len. I know which army I'd rather be on. And I would like to think if just a few thousand of those Canadians visited their Member of Parliament's office and said, you know, I have seen, you know, the information about this treaty, and I want you, as my elected representatives, I want you to go and make sure that that treaty is fair. I want you to make sure that when these companies come in and take lumber and gold and silver and precious metals diamonds out of these First Nations territories, I want you to ensure that those communities benefit from that wealth that's being taken from their territories. Significantly, each candidate of the three major parties in the Ontario provincial election promised to start for the first time, long overdue, resource revenue sharing in this province with Indigenous peoples. So Canadians can use their voices. They can meet and talk to Indigenous peoples and not treat them as if they were strangers in their own land. But more importantly, they can use their positions in society as teachers, as lawyers, as just plain voters, to wield an influence, because those 35 million people have far more power than those 300 who get elected.
Great. Thank you very much, Maurice. We have two questions, and I think that's probably all we'll have time for. Maurice, can you stay a few minutes past 11:30?
Oh, sure. I'm here as long as people want to talk.
Oh, dangerous offer, but thank you. Okay, so again, thanks for this presentation. I'm working in a South Asian organization and want to know what preliminary steps we can take to create allyship. Moreover, how do we educate and change our organizational education and do our homework before we try to become allies with you?
Oh, thank you. And you've taken the first step. Thank you. And it really is heartwarming to hear so many people who want Canada to be better. I believe there are only two kinds of people in the world. Not black or white or short or tall or, you know, I believe there are only two kinds of people in the world. The people who want the world to be the best place it can be for everybody, and then those other people. And if you want the world to be better for everybody, I don't think reconciliation is a binary thing between Indigenous peoples and everybody else in Canada. I think if reconciliation is done properly and involves most good-minded Canadians, it will make Canada a better place for the newest immigrants as well as the people who have been here the longest. Our medicine wheel talks about the human race that has four colors of people, red, yellow, black, and white. And I believe that reconciliation, if done properly, should benefit all of us and make us all, you know, Indigenous people say we're all related. Well, we should, if we treat each other like our closest, most cared for relatives, that'll make Canada a better country. And your organization could start the education process by, you have resource people in every community. You know, you could talk to if you're in Toronto, you could talk to the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. They have cross-cultural learning programs that they can work with your organization with. They can help you make contact with First Nations that you can visit and actually take a bus trip and actually learn about what life on a First Nation is like. But you've taken the first step, and thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thanks, Maurice. And our last question, which I suppose is a bit of asks for amplification on what you've already said, which is, thanks so much for your presentation. Are there good ways for settlers in Ontario to find out about current First Nation and other Indigenous rights struggles so that we can respectfully contribute and support? And as an example, such as the struggle in Ottawa. Are there particular organizations or media outlets, etc., that we should contact to learn more?
Yes, thank you again. And I hope that if you are, and if this question is coming from someone in Ottawa, I hope you go to the tomorrow to the walk. It starts at 10 o'clock in the morning at Victoria Island at the Booth Street entrance, and people walk through. I'm sorry I'm missing it this year for the first time. They walk through the city. It's a nice leisurely walk. Take an umbrella, you walk to Parliament Hill, and you get to meet and hear people speak. You will see there's an an organization there identifying itself as the Free the Falls movement. They have websites. Social media has all sorts of organizations. There's Idle No More has a Facebook page. There's no end of contact people at the university. They will have an Indigenous studies faculty. Contact people there. There just no end. Make contact with the closest First Nation. You mentioned Elder Albert Dumont, who's a friend of mine. Len, contact an Algonquin community. It's a growing network of people, but get involved. As I should have said to the earlier person, again, get to know people, talk to them, but go out to these events. Today, if there's an event, a National Indigenous Peoples event, go to it and talk to people. And don't be shy. I know people sometimes, they feel that, sometimes people actually feel guilty about Canada's past. We don't want to make people feel guilty. We don't want to make people feel afraid. We want them to want Canada to have a better 150 years, the next 150 years than the last. So thank you for caring.
Okay, Morris, we've come to the end of our time, and I think you have answered all of the questions that folks have offered, and a few additional ones as well. I'd like to thank everybody in the audience who took time to attend. Please do let your friends know who perhaps weren't able to attend that they can listen to a recorded version of this webinar on our website, and my colleague Prawn will make sure that when you come to the website, which is CRRF-FCRR.ca, that the link to this and other webinars will be readily seen. Morris, Javier, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts, your experience, and wisdom with us. Todarabah, Miigwech, and thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.
Yeah, Miigwech, Javier.